Now let's talk about the neck. Just like the headstock, the neck offers up a whole number of features that really can have an impact on performance and tone, but it can also have an impact on really how well defined your sound is in the context of a band. And the best way to talk about that is to look at the severity of the structural situation here with the neck. You have these strings that are applying roughly 140 pounds of pressure, of pull, and they're anchored to the bridge, this metal fixture. It's bolted into this arch top on this body. It's all very stable and very secure. And then you have this neck, this thin neck that extends out from the body quite a distance, and the strings are anchored up at the top, of course, through the machine heads. And with all of that tension, all that pull, really, the neck would love to come forward, but it doesn't. So the stability of this neck is critical, how stable that thing is based on materials and construction. And here's why. When you hit those strings with all of that pressure, all that pull, every time you hit the string, the neck wants to act like a shock absorber. In other words, you hit the string and it wants to just pull that energy off. And so the more rigid that neck is, the more stable it is, the more energy is going to stay on the string. Really strong effect on attack, but sustain and everything else is impacted. And when I started talking about how well defined your guitar is in the context of the band, here's how this figures in. When that energy on the string transfers into the neck, the more energy that transfers, the more complex that vibration is. And then there's this thing called regenerative energy, where that vibration from the neck will kick back onto the string and make the harmonic content of the string more and more rich until the point where it becomes almost muddy. And if you think about some of those traditional guitars that have the exposed necks like this, that are made out of mahogany, that really warm, dark sound, brown sound they call it sometimes, that's the charm in those instruments. But if you're trying to achieve performance, where you want that attack, you want that sustain, and you want to be well defined in the band, you have to do something more construction-wise. To begin with, the neck, material-wise, is made out of maple. It's actually 3 pieces of maple. 2 lamination seams run the entire length of the guitar, and that material, of course, goes right down to the tip of the tenon, which is what anchors the neck into the body, right to the top of the headstock. That maple material is very dense, it's hard, so it's wonderfully stable, especially given the structural demands of the neck. Even with the truss rod, the maple helps significantly. The hardness of that material, the density, of course, is going to make all the strings perform better, but you're going to notice an appreciable difference in the highs, the brightness, the clarity. Because it's laminated, and by laminated I mean from the very bottom right to the top, there are 2 seams that run up the middle about 1 inch apart. Those seams, those lamination seams, are standing perpendicular to the pull of the strings. So they're adding to the strength as well. So you take the performance benefits of the maple and take them up another notch. Next, because it's laminated, there's a great opportunity. We can reverse the grain on the pieces. And what happens from that is when the climate is humid, for example, and maybe one of the pieces of maple wants to bow or move in a particular direction, the other piece is going to want to go in the opposite direction. So you get this wonderful sort of self-leveling or self-stabilizing quality built right within the neck. And again, just adds to the stability. This heel is actually quite deep, and that adds to the structural stability of that neck. Again, reducing that sort of shock absorber effect. And when we were putting these designs together, putting the specs together, I could tell you almost exactly what each of these individual features that we're talking about would do, what the outcome of that would be. And I knew the heel would have an effect. But I really didn't think it would be as significant as this. And the reason I got so excited about this is we tried a number of different shapes, some quite a bit bigger than this, and it just didn't work, actually. It just put too much distance between your thumb and the high frets. But I learned just how incredible an impact that the heel can have on that performance. And you'll also note there's no cross lamination here, which you find typically on a lot of import guitars. And we'll talk about the binding again, but again, I just love this this capped heel with this white piping that follows around with the binding. Next, let's talk about the scale length. And that's, scale length is the distance, or the length, I should say, of the string from the saddles to the nut. There are really three prominent lengths. This particular guitar is 24 3/4. Your bolt-on neck guitars usually, and guitars outfitted with locking vibratos, are usually the 25.5-inch scale. And one very famous American company popularized a 25-inch scale. They sort of split the difference. The difference is this: the longer scale takes more tension to bring the string up to pitch. So you get a little more power, frankly, out of the string, but it has a bit of a raspiness on the high end. There's a little extra brightness there. The 24 3/4-inch scale, which is what we selected, takes less tension. So it's easier on the hand when you're bending notes and so on. But there were other reasons that we chose this particular scale. All the things we've talked about so far with the neck in terms of improving performance, when you make that neck a little shorter because of the scale, you improve those things yet again, because the neck, by being a bit shorter, becomes a little bit more rigid. But there is one more thing about this that really was a determining factor. As we've gone through this, you're learning that these guitars are all about pushing those boundaries of performance, but trying to do it in a way that we also capture a mid-range presence that is really muscular but defined. This is one of those areas where we could pick up some of that mid-range, because that shorter scale is just ever so slightly less bright. And I say less bright because we're picking up the sense of that warmth, not so much by adding mid-range, but by taking away some of the raspiness. So when everything is considered, we're getting that mid-range that's defined that we want. We're getting still a better string performance because of the shorter neck and the stability that we picked up. And then when it comes to expressing yourself through bending and so on, it's just wonderful, really easy on the hands. Next, let's talk about the shape of the neck. If you go online, you'll see U shapes, D shape, C shape, soft C, V shape, oval, which is really elliptical. The best way I can describe this, the shape of this neck, is it's sort of like an ellipse. In other words, it's a soft curve, and we modified it about a quarter of the way in on both sides. We just added a bit more shoulder, and what that allowed for is you wind up with a nice consistent shape right here. And if you use your thumb a lot on the back of the neck, it just feels really comfortable and really consistent. And then the little bit of extra depth in those shoulders just adds to the stability of the neck. Next, width of the nut. And we chose 1 11/16. My experience is that probably the majority of the necks are 1 5/8, maybe a little more, a little less. So this is just about a 1/16 of an inch wider, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that little bit of width just gives you room for accuracy that is really wonderful. If you remember back in the 80s when the whole metal thing really took off and all the fingerboard gymnastics became so popular, electric necks got up to 1 7/8 inch. So this is just a nice combination of width for accuracy and comfort. And by the way, so many people, when they think of necks, the sort of the default mode is they want a really thin neck. And so I would suggest, if that's your perspective, grab a pencil and squeeze it for all you're worth. You cramp up right away, it's just very uncomfortable. If you squeeze a pipe that's 2.5, 3 inches big, let's say, you're very open and you have a lot of endurance. So that little tiny bit of extra width just makes for a great neck, a great professional feel. Again, the neck, a tremendous opportunity to affect tone, performance, attack, sustain, and really, in the context of a band, just a way to make sure that your sound is defined and you're cutting through that mix. Now let's talk about the fingerboard. We selected ebony as the material, and this is an incredibly dense, hard material. Happens to be a bit heavy too, but when you combine that density, that strength, with the maple neck, a 3-piece laminated maple neck, the neck may as well be made out of iron. I mean, the string is just on fire. It's like it's turbocharged. And because of the density of that material, just like with maple, you're going to push the highs, you're going to increase or improve the efficiency of all the strings, so you'll feel a little bit on the low end as well. And also because the strings are resting on the fingerboard when you play, that density isn't as likely to pull energy off the string. So again, you're keeping the energy where it's supposed to be. The pearloid inlay, which is synthetic, but it's laser cut, and the pocket that receives it in the neck is also cut with a laser. So it's disturbing how precise this whole thing looks. Years ago, you would put an inlay in and there'd be a gap around it that had to be filled with epoxy that had been mixed with ebony dust. So it just really looks clean. The radius on the fingerboard, and that refers to the curve that's here. This is a very flat fingerboard. It's a 12.5-inch radius, actually just a tiny smidge larger than that. And from a playing perspective, here's what that means. When you're bending a note, you're not bending over a curve. You're not bending into that curve. So it really feels great. And coupled with the fact that this was that 24.75-inch neck, 10-gauge strings actually, to me, feel like 9-gauge strings. So the radius allows for that bending. And very often, if you have an extreme radius, you'll find that when you bend like the B string sort of midway up the neck, that straight string actually has to go over the curve in the fingerboard, and you can actually kill the note. We're using jumbo nickel silver frets. The specifications are sort of similar to a 6100 style fret. This was another area where we were actually able to pick up some of that warmth by reducing the brightness on the high end. You'll find a lot of guitars using stainless steel frets these days, and those are very hard and they do push the highs. They can be really great on the right guitar. We opted for nickel silver. It just is a bit warmer. It's also a jumbo fret, which means that when you're bending, sort of the meat of your finger can get under that string, and it just feels like you have tremendous control, and it just allows you to be really, really expressive. And wrapping up with the fingerboard, let's talk about the binding. We use a 3-ply reverse black binding, and so you've got that heavy band of black on the outside, and I just love this fine white line of piping, which also has another fine line of black on the inside. So it looks great, it looks crisp, it's not overbearing. A couple of nice things about binding is the fret has what's called a tang slot, because it's sort of shaped like a T, and that's the part that is pushed into the fingerboard. Well, with the binding, you cover that tang slot, and in terms of finishing and stuff, you don't have the chance of getting finished into the slot and then popping out as the wood expands and contracts. So it looks really finished. And also, when you're finishing the raw guitar, you're able to sand that edge just a little bit, just kind of roll it in a little bit, and so it just feels really soft on your hand. It's not a real hard edge.